Follow the White Rabbit is a game that will teach you practical politics. Practical politics is called practical politics because it is non-voting, which makes it very, very practical. Conventional politics is, of course, rule-based politics, which is what you do at the voting booth. It's very, very rule-based and timeline-based, you know, every 4 years, every 2 years, so on and so forth. And full-spectrum practical politics is engaging and taking out an opponent or a system or a corporation, so on and so forth, by any means necessary under the rules or under the laws, but never breaking the rules or never breaking the laws. But to understand anything, we first have to teach you practical politics, which is non-voting politics. The first basics are the art of staying on point or using a talking point and being able to say it over and over again to make your point, not arguing, just making a point. But this is an introduction again to Follow the White Rabbit, and Follow the White Rabbit is a game that will teach you practical politics. White Rabbit history is one big mystery. That's about all yours truly has come to conclusion on in the past 10 years, especially in the past, let's say 5. And this is in 2009, June 2009. The last 5 years, my mind's been blown wide open, especially coming about 5 years ago. But let's go back to the American Revolution, because I already talked about that. American Revolution, some say, was against some bankers out of Europe, against the oppressive debt, against George III. Some say all the above, some just say George III. But we have an interesting historical revisionist, and historical revisionism is very important for every history in the world, especially when it comes to European history or in the history of the indigenous white rabbits of Europe, because we don't know anything. No, we're clueless, and everyone, when the internet came out, we got a glimpse at how clueless we were. Yeah, because the first thing that was huge was all this revisionist history. And most of you are familiar with one branch, that's Holocaust. It's stuff geared toward the World War II, and I'm going to get to that in a few. But that is the tip of the iceberg in World War II history. Yeah, that type of revisionism is a tip of the iceberg. That is stuff that gets a lot of public play, but I'm going to point you to some stuff that has blown some minds, even at the upper hierarchies of things. But anyways, going back to the American Revolution, you got revolution against George III and some bankers, and they kicked him out of there. But Andrew Hamilton brought out this First Bank of the U.S. And First Bank of the U.S. was basically a bank paying back George III interest on loans or whatever. I guess they couldn't get out of paying him all the money, or someone left a foot in the door or whatever. But that First Bank of the U.S. was there, and there was a tie to the Bank of England. So they didn't fully kick these bankers out of there. No, they didn't. And Eustace Mullins, that's EUSTACEMULLINS, is a historical revisionist that brought out that book ages ago called The New World Order, talking about all this stuff, talking about these banksters, these bankers. And he was a student of Ezra Pound, the famous poet Ezra Pound, and he started looking into this, and he went over this. And actually, you can get online, and you can probably find him on Google or YouTube, and you can actually probably watch him for a while. And he's a great historical revisionist when it comes down to these bankers and how far stuff goes back, the tip of the iceberg, as you say, when you start digging into this stuff. But anyways, they brought out this First Bank of the U.S., and that was Alexander Hamilton, and that was tied to the Bank of England. Well, that charter was revoked by Jefferson. Yeah, that Thomas Jefferson didn't so much like that, so when he came into power, he revoked that charter. And that charter came up for renewal, and he says, well, I don't like this Bank of England over these ties to the Bank of England, and we don't need any of these bankers here, and we kicked most of them out of here from Europe. We don't need these ones out of London, so we're just going to kick them out of there. They were all tied to the Rothschilds in one way, shape, manner, or form. But then a year later, you end up in the War of 1812. Now, if you read your history books, you think the War of 1812 was about, the British grabbing sailors, and it was a naval war, and there's all this, all this garbage. The War of 1812. The War of 1812 happened because Great Britain was trying to punish this colony, United States, for not only kicking them out of there, but for refusing their banking, for not keeping their First Bank of the U.S. in there, which had ties to the Bank of England. They were trying to punish them for that, and they of course lost that. So then you come forward to to a Rothschild agent that got his foot in the door, and they started the second bank of the U.S. Yeah, how did that happen? I don't know. Eustace Mullins talks about this stuff, but someone got their foot in the door and had the second bank of the U.S. And the second bank of the U.S. was chartered, and it came in. It came in under a little different auspices. It was, but it was still somewhat connected to one of the other Rothschilds out of Paris. And the second bank of the U.S. came in, and of course, it stayed in. It stayed in until Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson came in, and he gave the famous speech that he was going to root out the bankers because they're a brood of vipers, or a nest of vipers. He sounds like a Jesus or something. A generation of vipers in there, and he basically kicked it out, or basically suspended all their deposits, or took all the money out of that bank, and that was 1836. And then in 1837, of course, you have the big collapse of 1837, and when he removed all the deposits, one of the Rothschild agents or whatever made it impossible for America to operate internationally, and that ended up in the big banking crisis of 1837, and that's when the Rothschilds came in after that and bought everything for pennies on the dollars, and shortly thereafter, fortunes were in the middle of Morgan's fortune was started, and all these big American fortunes were started after that. But that is a brief overview, and Eustace Mullins has been critical to getting into how this came about and stuff like that. And it is quite an education, because you're not going to get it in the textbooks, are you? No. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. So when I say they kicked a bunch of bankers out of here, well, they didn't kick them all out of here, and we still got them to this day. And sure, you think the Federal Reserve isn't tied to all that? Yeah, it is. There's a new book coming out. I mentioned Joseph P. Farrell. I'm going to go into him a little bit more because I just found out something just a day ago, that he is bringing out a book called Banksters from Here to Babylon, and he traces their origins back to the temples of Babylon. The temples of Babylon, they used to use priests for trade. In other words, the priests were very respected, and they would go to another part of the colony with these little tablets, these little orders, and they would trade wheat, corn, whatever, and that's how they instigated trade. And they would have currency, and the currency was state sponsored, maybe a little clay piece of currency. But this crew got it started there, and it should be an interesting read to what he comes up with. It's going to be fascinating because I know their calendar goes back to Babylon. Sure. Now you might think it's your average Hebrew, your local rabbi. Most likely isn't. It may be your local Protestant minister attached to these. Yeah, they're attached to fraternities or whatever. But it's pretty interesting stuff, and it has everything to do with certain families at the top of Anglosphere that become very very famous. That Red Shield, or the Rothschilds, whose name was actually Bars, yeah, they changed their name to the Red Shield because that was their sign, which is interesting in itself. Yeah, your enemy's sign is always red. Period. Red. I told you that red hippopotamus, that goes back to the Egyptian mythology, but it's not. It's more cosmic than you think. But anyways, that's a brief overview. And Eustace Mullins, and the student of Ezra Pound, has been instrumental in bringing this stuff out. And he's, when it comes down to historical revisionists, what most of the white nationalists are used to, or what most of the people are used to when they start looking at the total struggle for Europeans, you're dealing with the tip of the iceberg of what's coming down, what has come out, especially since the internet. When the internet come out, everything was historical revisions all over the world, but especially when it comes to Europeans. And more people around the world are looking at this stuff than actually white people. Yeah, more people are interested in us than white people are interested in themselves. It's kind of interesting. But I'm going to jump over to Joseph P. Farrell because someone heard number 5 and number 6 are probably going to come out about the same time, and I let someone hear number 5, and I brought up the Black Sun, and that's very controversial. It's very controversial to start bringing up Black Sun, but let me go into where this came across my desk. I was having a conversation with someone, and they were talking about the different science topics coming across in Russia, and they were talking about Richard C. Hoagland. Well, Richard C. Hoagland writes all kinds of fantastical stuff about the spaceships and NASA and all kinds of stuff. You can look him up, come to your own opinion, but that's no big deal to me because he didn't talk about race. But then something interesting happened. They talked about the Russians were covering this particular new book by Hoagland and the different topics discussed by Joseph P. Farrell on some different news networks there. And the Russians can put out stuff in a roundabout way. Sometimes you want to put out stuff on Pravda. It sounds ridiculous, but you might want to put it out there just to air it out. For instance, the Russians put out there they're going to ship in all the great farmers from